Good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Moore. I'm the director of Volteface, the think tank in London, which is exploring alternatives to current drug policies. Volteface.me if you want to find out more about our work. Is anyone here using Twitter to tweet this event, or tweet any updates from this event? No? Okay, that's fine. It's one thing I don't have to worry about. So over the course of the next hour, I want to introduce our three panelists, Clark, Gavin and Crispin, I'll let them introduce themselves. But what I want to really do is just explore some of the very contemporary issues around medical cannabis. It's an issue that has become much more salient, I think, in the last 3 or 4 months here in the UK because of a number of quite high-profile cases beginning to emerge. Our three panelists are all very conversant in this issue and from different perspectives. Crispin from a political perspective, Gavin from a business perspective, and Clark from a campaigning perspective. So I'm going to do a very quick kind of little interview with each of them, and then I'm going to invite some questions. But hopefully it'll be a chance for you to, it'll be an illuminating session. I think we could have three better qualified people to comment on this issue here today. So, Clark, do you want to introduce yourself to the audience first before I begin, yeah?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Clark. I am the founder of the United Patients Alliance. The United Patients Alliance is the UK's leading medical cannabis advocacy group. I came to found it through personal reasons. In 2010, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And multiple sclerosis is a neurological condition which affects me in many, many different ways. My main symptoms include pain and spasms, and I need a walking stick, and it takes a lot of my life away from me. However, I found that when I consumed cannabis, my life was much, much better. It reduced my pain, it reduced my spasms, and it basically gives me a much better quality of life. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So because of that, I realised that there was a real need to campaign and to separate the issues from the wider drug reform world and to just focus on the patients and to essentially get the patients off the battlefield first, because it's really, really important that sick people are no longer criminalised and no longer marginalised and stigmatised for consuming cannabis to help them. So it's a really big passion of mine, and I've pretty much dedicated my life to it now because cannabis has given me my life back. So it's something that I can do to try and help. We do, with the United Patients Alliance, we do a lot of different things, including supporting the patients that are suffering under prohibition, including lobbying and talking to politicians, and including raising awareness of medical cannabis in the public sphere. So that's kind of what we do as an organisation.
So can I just take a few questions there? So say, before you, had you used cannabis before?
Yes, I had, yeah.
You had used it, yeah. Were you a regular user?
I was, at the weekends I would consume cannabis. I always preferred cannabis over alcohol as a student, because I always found that when I was studying, at the weekends I could go out and I could consume cannabis with my friends, and then in the weeks I would be fully focused and able to do all of my work, all of my assignments and get everything done. Whereas if I consumed alcohol, I'd be so hungover that I'd miss lectures, I'd miss assignments, and so I found it was definitely the drug of choice for me to get through university and still have fun. And I was diagnosed when I was at university, so it was only when I was going out with my friends at the weekends and I realised, hang on a minute, I'm feeling better now that I'm consuming cannabis, that I really realised that. And it led me to stop all of the opioid-based pain medication that I was taking.
And how did you, once you were diagnosed and you realised that the best form of pain relief came from cannabis, were you able to talk to your doctor about that?
Yeah. My doctor was supportive. 90% of my healthcare professionals are supportive. Sometimes it takes a little bit of teaching them, like what the endocannabinoid system is and a few different things like that. But generally, every healthcare professional is in support.
And they were supportive of you coming off opiates?
Yes.
Okay. Was that something that took a bit of time to convince them? Yeah.
So I mean, I was on, when I was first diagnosed, I took a load of drugs before, and then I started to take some after. I was on 11 different drugs in total, and I slowly weaned myself off of all of them one by one, and now I only take one drug called somatropam, which is when I get really, really intense bad migraines. And that's the only pharmaceutical that I take at all now.
So you don't have any treatment from the NHS at all?
Any medication from the NHS, treatment from the. I'm very keen on non-pharmaceutical based treatment, and I will push for that with the NHS. And I've had CBT, I've had some swimming sessions, I've had counselling, I've had a lot of other different things that. So I still really, really love the NHS for what they can do for me, but I don't necessarily take the traditional path of taking the medications.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about the formation of the movement that you established. How did that come about?
So I was first campaigning, when I was first diagnosed, I realised that cannabis really helped me, and I wanted to do something about it because I just kind of finished my university, and I couldn't work because I was too ill. So I was kind of in a limbo land of, okay, what do I do now? Well, now that I can't really work, and that, you know, my life plan and my life goal, like, taken away, like, not able to do that anymore. What do I do now, kind of thing. So I started to look into the campaigning aspect, saying, like, do you know what, I really want to do something about this, because if this can help me as much as it can help me, there'll be millions of other people out there will have a similar story and shouldn't be criminalised for taking cannabis. So I started to look into it, and I found that there wasn't really much in the way of campaigning, especially in terms of professional campaigning. There was no professional campaign. So I founded several different organisations in the lead up, including Normal UK, including the United Kingdom Cannabis Social Clubs, with various different other activists. Yeah. But the recreational side of the campaign was very reluctant to push the medical angle. Yeah. It didn't feel like it wasn't right to just allow the patients the access and exclude everybody else. But I realised just from travelling to America and seeing the industry out there that the only way that the British public and that the British politicians were going to be able to change their minds was if we went for a medical access first. And they weren't going to listen. They were not going to listen if we were talking about everything else. Yeah. So I stepped away from the overall campaign to found the United Patients Alliance and to focus purely on the patients and purely on patient access to cannabis.
And so how many members do you have now of the United Patients Alliance?
We have 5,000 members in our group.
Okay. And what kind of conditions does that cover?
So you have people like me with MS, you have people with epilepsy, we have people with fibromyalgia, ME, mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, diabetes. There's so many. Cancer. What else? Arthritis. Like, the list is so long.
And tell us a little bit more about what sort of activities you get up to.
So we, as I said earlier, there's kind of like three main goals and three main focuses of the United Patients Alliance as a group. First and foremost, and why we were founded, was for political campaigning, to raise awareness and to try to lobby politicians to change the law. Essentially, that was the number one goal of founding the organisation. And then the secondary, we really wanted to raise awareness to the public, because we feel, well, obviously the public can put pressure onto their MPs to also change the law. So we wanted to create an atmosphere in which MPs would feel comfortable stepping their head above the parapet and go, no, do you know what, these people should be allowed access to cannabis as a medicine. And then thirdly, it wasn't really our aim to do that, and it's kind of happened as an organic thing after we found it, but that is to support the patients. And so we do a lot of workshops and social meetups and stuff like that, which a lot of sick people, unfortunately, when you're ill, when you're in pain all of the time, it's quite difficult to get out and to have a social life. And it's really made that for a lot of people, and really got a lot of people out of the house that otherwise wouldn't be able to. So just to do a little thing, just to meet some people. So it's a support group as well, definitely. So in terms of our campaigning, I think it really started when I met with Norman Baker. Norman Baker was the former drugs minister, and he was the MP of Lewis. And I went to meet him and got on very well with him, and he changed his mind and realised that cannabis was medicine, and subsequently came out and said, became the first drugs minister to call for legal medical cannabis. So that was kind of the first success we had, and paved the way for our continued campaigning.
Okay. And suppose the criticism that you confronted with a lot of the time is that this is the thin edge of the wedge. And And you've had to acknowledge that to some extent by separating yourself away from recreational cannabis campaigns. Are you still do you still get that coming?
Yeah, we do, definitely.
You have to argue,
And yeah, we definitely get that. But the thing is, it's really, I think people can't understand that. I don't know. I think it's just really important to separate between a health issue and a fun issue. Like I think there's nothing. I don't have any problem with people enjoying themselves in whichever the way they see fit. But in terms of running a professional campaign in which you seek to change the law of a lot of people who don't think that way, to go in on that is very. You're just going to get going to get a closed door. I think it's definitely not the thin end of the wedge because it's real. I can tell you it's real because I feel it every single day. I'm in pain, I consume cannabis, and then my pain is lowered. I have bladder weakness, I consume cannabis, and then I don't have bladder weakness. I have spasms, I consume cannabis, and then the spasms stop. I can't walk very far, so I consume cannabis, and then I can walk further. So I know it's not the thin end of the wedge, and I know that it's real. However, it is something that we have definitely had to be aware of and be careful about with what we do and don't say, who we do and don't associate with, because unfortunately that is the way of the world currently. That is the political landscape. So.
Okay, and just one final question from me before we sort of open it up. So we've polled public opinion on this issue, my think tank, and the last time we polled it, 78% of people supported medical cannabis in the UK, whatever that means. We dug a little bit deeper into that, and essentially what that means effectively is the public don't expect people like Clark to be arrested and put in prison, or they don't expect the police to come round to his house and have him arrested. That's kind of essentially as far as we go. We even went on to poll MPs last year as well, and we found a majority of MPs largely supportive as well. I think the issue seems to be, I'd like you to sort of comment on this if you can, Clark, is overwhelmingly people seem to support. There seems to be very little political or public resistance to medical cannabis. The difficulty seems to be how do you find a solution which addresses widespread public concerns about drug use and cannabis use in particular. So I'd like you to, if you could, articulate what would, in the ideal world, what would a legal medical cannabis be like for you? Is it your right to grow cannabis? Is it your right to smoke cannabis? Do you think the health community and healthcare in the community in the UK are going to accept a medicine that's combustible? Or do you see something that's pharmaceutical grade products be emerging?
I think that actually there's scope for all of those because the United Patients Alliance fundamentally believes that patients should be allowed to grow their own at home if they so wish. However, most people wouldn't want to do that. Much like alcohol, you can brew your own alcohol at home if you want to, but most people choose not to because it's a lot of effort, it's a lot of hassle, and the quality that you get when you do it yourself is nowhere near on the level that you can get when it's regulated. So I would envision a mixed way of going about it. I think first and foremost, patients need to be dealing with this with their doctors. So there needs to be a doctor's recommendation, a doctor's talking through with a patient that maybe this is the right option for you. There needs to be regulated growing where all of the pesticides, all the nutrients, all of the things that go into it are regulated. There also needs to be a way in which safeguards to protect children. So packaging, for example, needs to be very much in the way of pharmaceutical companies of a medicine, of a package with a warning label, with all of the side effects, with all of the problems that could happen as well. So I think with that knowledge would change a lot of different things. I think that is one of the biggest problems with the fear that people have around cannabis is that a lot of the reason why cannabis can have a negative impact and can be bad is because people don't have the right information or the right knowledge to deal with what happens when if you take too much. What do you do? People don't know.
Sure.
So
Okay.
I think one of the biggest things is education.
Okay, that's good. Can I have some questions here for Clark from the floor, if possible? Yeah. Do you want to say who you are, please?
I'm a consultant psychiatrist. Can you tell us, you said you consume cannabis.
Yes.
What form do you consume it in?
I consume cannabis in herbal form, in flower form, but I take it in oil, so I eat it.
Yes.
I put it in topical, so I rub it onto my skin directly into areas of pain, and I also vaporize it.
And you prepare that yourself?
Yes, I do.
From a particular brand that you know a lot?
Yeah. It is THC that is definitely the most pain relieving for me. when I have CBD and THC together, I don't get the same level of quality of life, basically.
And is that kind of preparation available, sort of forgive my ignorance, in California, in Colorado,
Yes.
in the US states?
Yes, it is, yeah.
So you can get that and it's commercially manufactured,
Yes, yeah.
which would possibly be clearly easier to
Yes.
do than the purer
Yeah.
evidence to your preparation.
No, 100%. You're right.
And is it better for you, sort of a clinical question, to consume it as you swallow it, you
Yeah.
eat it, and you put it
Yeah,
in an
vaporizer.
electric
Yeah.
vaporizer, which is better for you?
I would say
Vaporizer
it depends on the symptom. So for my spasms and for a lot of my bladder weakness and problems, I need the instant effect of vaporization. So when you inhale it through your lungs, it instantly goes into your blood and takes instant effect. Whereas when you eat it, obviously it takes up to an hour, maybe a little bit longer to take effect. So I personally prefer vaporizing because I'm in pain and I want that instant relief. I don't want to be in pain for the next hour. I want to not be in pain now. So I find that vaporizing is definitely my preferred method.
And would do the respirologists say that inhaling the vapor is potentially damaging to your lungs?
Well, there isn't much studies on vaporizing, but there's a study by Donald Tashkin of UCLA he did a 20-year study into smoking cannabis, and he found that cannabis smoke actually, if you smoke it pure, only not if you consume it with tobacco, but it actually slightly lowers your risk of ear, nose, throat and lung cancer, very, very, very slightly. And because vaporizing obviously reduces the amount of carcinogens that you're taking in, because you're only vaporizing the active ingredients rather than burning any of the plant material or the leaf or anything, that risk will be even lower. So I would assume, I haven't read an article to prove it, but I would assume that vaporizing, as it has less carcinogens in it, would also do the same thing as that study found. Yeah.
Thank you. Next one, please. Say who you are, please.
Yeah, I'm Ola from Washington. I want to find out if your experience of the...
Okay. I want to
Where are
find
you
out.
from, sorry?
I'm from CGL.
Yeah.
I want to find out if your experience regarding the THC being a little bit better for you, is that the general norm or is just particular for you?
So the United Patients Alliance, as part of our campaigning, we worked with the APPG on drug reform to produce their what do you call it?
2016 report.
Yeah, the report, thank you.
Review
of cannabis as medicine. And within that we did a patient survey, and we surveyed just under 700 patients. And we found that only 9% of patients like CBD, and actually 91% of patients prefer high THC cannabis, yeah. So overall it is about 1 in 10 people prefer CBD, but 9 in 10 people prefer THC for medicine, yeah.
Okay. Any further questions? Yes, please.
I know we were talking about...
So you say who you are, please?
Oh, sorry. Hi, my name's Ben. I work for Centre Points Health and Wellbeing Team. So
Okay.
these 25-year-old families, young people with substance use issues. Just with the population that I work with and their age, I do get a lot of self-reportation of people that are using cannabis for medicinal use, or let's just say it alleviates symptoms.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the main problematic thing that their cannabis use presents for them is the criminal justice issues, and it also puts their tenancy at risk. So, you know, they're secondary issues to their actual health issues. But for me, working on a harm minimisation approach, I'm trying to reduce the potential harms that their cannabis use does.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sceptical as to, you know, how many of them do actually believe they are alleviating symptoms or managing their own conditions. But at the ages that they are, a lot of them are experiencing, you know, early onset of a lot of mental health issues and some physical health issues, and there's a whole range. I can appreciate that a lot of doctors will find it very difficult to diagnose my client group, A, because of the age, and because of then obviously the other mix of illicit substance use.
Yeah.
But if you can see that there is going to be some kind of benefit for this individual and that there is an alleviation of symptoms, there's going to be a gap in the market where, or in the group where there'll be undiagnosed people self-medicating with cannabis that may well, if you do get the push for the medicinal cannabis bill to be available, I do feel like I'm still going to miss out with a lot of my clientele group, and they'll end up back on the black market and kind of classed as recreational users and maybe penalised for that. So
There's Catherine Jacobson, who's a scientist at Tilray, one of the largest Canadian companies. She talks about not 2 recreational medical, but 3 recreational medical in between therapeutic. So she's very helpfully made those definitions. I think they're important ones as well in the context of what you just said.
Yeah, okay, so it's acknowledging the therapeutic benefits of this for that population.
I think we
Yeah.
might need, yeah.
I would agree.
Okay, cool. Well,
Yeah. I mean, I think we've all encountered that, haven't we?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Any final questions for Clark? Yes, sorry. Two more here. I'll just go to you first.
My
Sorry.
background's education, social
Yeah.
education. Right, thank you. Can I just be absolutely clear?
Yeah.
You're actually suggesting that it would be prescription only, is that correct?
Yeah, it would be prescribed,
Okay.
yeah.
And what exact percentage of THC?
It would really vary from patient to patient. So some people need very, very small amounts, but some people need very, very large amounts. So it's going to have to, like you would vary a form of any medication, you tailor it to the patient. It would be the same way. So for me, for example, I need very, very, very high amounts of THC. But then for some other people that I know who might have some various mental health conditions, they really don't want that. They want a one-to-one THC to CBD content. So we're really going to have to really educate healthcare professionals on what different types of cannabis do.
Yeah, because that's quite scary, because we get
Yeah.
massive amounts of research, haven't
Yeah.
we, on, you get in the streets of London, skunk, high THC and psychosis, and
Yeah.
I just recently visited some people in the Maudsley Hospital. So what percentage of THC do you take?
Because I have to grow my own, I don't have any lab testing, I don't actually know. See, this is one of the problems that I face, is that if I was in a regulated market, if I was in California or Colorado, everything that I take would be lab tested and I'd know exactly what was in it. But here, I can't do that. So I actually can't answer you that question because I don't myself know yet. All I know is that in comparison to pretty much everyone else I meet, I need a lot.
Yeah, it's scary stuff. I mean, I'm following very closely Colorado, Canada, California. I've just got a recent 140-page document for Colorado because they are monitoring it so much. And if you go down to Denver and you talk to some people, it's all not as rosy as you might think. But thank you very much indeed.
I think
That's a recreational market, just to be
Yeah.
clear.
Yes.
It's a full adult use market, yeah.
I just have one final question. Please.
Yes, I'm a psychotherapist at a hospital in London, and a patient of mine recently mentioned that she was getting CBD
Yeah.
oil, and it helped a lot with anxiety.
Yeah.
And she said she'd found out that a lot of her friends were using it and it reduced the anxiety. Now, I used to use cannabis many, many years ago,
Yeah.
quite extensively in the 60s and 70s, and then I stopped because I started practicing meditation. So I was very surprised to hear this, and I started investigating, well, what's the difference? And to hear you saying that the THC component is helpful for you,
Yeah.
I mean, like, as this lady was saying, there's so much evidence of the psychotic, episodes
I think you have
that
to
can
put it into
occur.
context. I think you have to put it into context of all the 11 other drugs that I would be taking. What are the serious, severe side effects that I could be getting that from them? And then you put the comparison to cannabis, and actually, yes, that is a risk for a very, 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 very small amount of people. But one of the chemotherapy drugs that I'm on could kill me. So I'm allowed to take something that could kill me, but I'm not allowed something that has a very small chance of making somebody who already has a problem with psychotic problems, potentially triggering it and making it come out.
Yeah, my experience, I mean, back in the day when I used to use a lot, and then since then, observing people using and so on, and even in myself, is that it can exacerbate an inclination to become more paranoid or more withdrawn, or to trigger depression, So I'm very wary of the thought.
Again,
of
I think that
THC.
although that is true, you need to look at the wider social context of why is that paranoia or is that rational fear of the consequences of prohibition?
No, nothing to do with that.
I mean, a lot of it is rational fear.
Perhaps we can keep that conversation moving for the final when we go to the final questions. But thanks for all those questions, all very helpful. I'd like to move on to the next stage now, which is to introduce Gavin. One of the things that's become very apparent this year is the extent of the influence of the new legal markets across the world and the businesses that are servicing those legal markets in California, in Canada. We're in California moved to a fully recreational market on the 1st of January. Later this year, probably around September, Canada will as well. So what you're seeing now is the growth of very substantial private sector companies who are basically going to service these markets. And the most influential drug reform campaigner in history, Ethan Nadelman, who retired last year, who was the founder and president of the Drug Policy Alliance, in an interview in Fox magazine in the US at the start of the year, this year, said that in 2018 would be the first year where business had more influence than activism on cannabis legalization across the world. And over the course of the last few months, you've seen more and more coverage of these cannabis companies forming all around the world, and also the extent to which they're financed from London. So last week I was featured in a 2-page spread in the Times, which is based on a conference that took place in the Mayfair Hotel 2 weeks ago, where hundreds of people gathered who were investing or setting up cannabis businesses. So you'll see more and more of the commentary around this as it becomes obvious that both private families and private family funds and also institutional investors here in London are providing a substantial amount of startup capital for this new industry. And you can expect to see this grow over the course of the next year. Every day, if you pick up the newspaper, you'll see new jurisdictions beginning to open up cannabis markets around the world. I'm personally inundated with invitations to Berkeley Square every week to come and meet people who want to open up these markets. So I thought it'd be very useful to get the business perspective from one of our leading kind of entrepreneurs and investors here in the UK, Gavin. So Gavin, do you want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background?
Pleasure to be here. My name's Gavin Sathianathan. I'm a chemical engineer by training, studied a mile down the road at Imperial College. I then joined Bain & Company, the consulting firm, spent 4 years here in London, and then a year out in Delhi setting up an office. I then went to Harvard Business School, completed my MBA studies there, came back to London and spent a decade working at the intersection of technology, media and retail at places like Endemol, the TV company that makes Big Brother and Deal or No Deal. I was then one of the early guys at Facebook here in London, interfacing with the European startup ecosystem, and then joined Tesco and drove the digital media business there. Until about 2014, where I stumbled across a piece of research from one of my old professors at Harvard talking about the cannabis industry in Colorado. I was coming to the end of my time at Tesco. I was thinking about what life after the corporate world could look like, and decided to take my wife and 2 kids to Boulder, and we had 3 months in Boulder, Colorado in the summer of 2015, sort of witnessing what this new recreational cannabis market looked like. And really, until you've seen how these markets are structured and what they look like in North America, it's very difficult to get a sense for just how transformative this model could be. So you move from having your mental model of like a drug dealer on a street in London in a car with a bag of something that you don't know to a fully regulated industry where mainstream Americans are going in to consume products that look nothing like cannabis, that look like regular branded products in categories like food and drink and creams and tinctures and oils. And really the cannabis plant becomes a sort of input into this range of products that will apply to the medical world, the health and wellness world, and then the recreational category. I came back to London in 2016, raised a round of money from some high net worths and family offices here, put together a team of some of my old classmates from Harvard and did 2 things. One, set up a licensed business in the US around the production of medical cannabis products. And 2, set up a joint venture with the University of Oxford here called Oxford Cannabinoid Technologies, which is focused on the medical research into 4 key areas. Cancer, and that's 2 things within cancer, chemo, and actually looking at the cellular pathways for cell apoptosis. So can we cure cancer, kill tumours through cannabinoids and terpenes within the plant? The next area was in chronic pain. 30% of the patients in the organisation that Clark runs use cannabis for pain relief. And there's some really smart guys at Oxford growing pain cells out of stem cells and all the rest of it to fire cannabinoids. And so there's a real big market in pain. Neurodegenerative diseases, that's things like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, epilepsy, autism. And then finally, anti-inflammatory, so inflammatory diseases, so things like arthritis, and Crohn's, and IBS. So 4 key sort of clinical research areas, which we've spun up with the University of Oxford. And really, I spend my time now working with governments across Europe to try and get them to understand what a regulated cannabis industry could look like for patients. There are now 13 EU countries with some form of medical cannabis legislation. Set aside North America for one moment, because I think the recreational model over there confuses slightly the way we think about the medical market in Europe. Europe will be a medical market with medical cannabis products, not really in the form of raw flower, much more in the form of sort of standardized, finished dosage medicines that doctors feel very comfortable prescribing. And they will be prescribed for a range of conditions, and a patient will go to a doctor, get a prescription for a particular product, and go to their pharmacy, pick up that product, and go home and consume it. And it won't really be seen as a cannabis product. It will be seen as a medicine. It's fundamental in my space to understand what the endocannabinoid system is, how it interrelates with all the other systems in the body, how these compounds that are found in the cannabis plant modulate our behavior, how these systems interact with each other. And really, we've had this collective delusion globally for the past 80 or 90 years, where we've prohibited cannabis, and all of that research that we really should have been doing over the last 80, 90 years has to sort of be crammed into the next 10 or 15 years so we can get to the place where we have these medicines. And so I now work with university institutions around the world to spin up these research programs with academics to try and get to the clinical trial data that we need. One of the key impediments is actually getting to this clinical trial data. It's the only way we'll persuade really the medical establishment to move on cannabis as a medicine. Unfortunately, with cannabis as a Schedule I substance, it's almost mission impossible for an academic to get hold of the relevant licenses to import, handle, store, execute on all the research that needs to happen. I've just been through the process with the Home Office, with an institution like Oxford, and it's like pulling teeth. It really is. And that plays into how we think about getting access to these medicines for folks in the UK. So top level, that's what I've been up to for the last few years.
It's interesting. You've different. What you're saying is different from what Clark's been saying. Because Clark's been saying he's campaigning so that his members can grow cannabis. But you're saying there's no hope of that in Europe, in your view.
When I go and sit down with healthcare regulators, that's the last thing that they want to talk about. The idea that a patient can grow medicine. I think this is going to be a staged evolution in the growth of the market. And really, when you look at how European markets in particular evolve, typically what happens is they say, there's a iconic patient case where it seems immoral to deny access to patients for this medicine. And so, for example, Ireland is a good case study. They've picked out 4 conditions: cancer, epilepsy, MS, and chronic pain, and they're willing to import finished cannabis medicines, standardized dosage, from a couple of licensed manufacturers, one in Holland, one in Canada. And if it's a medicine of last resort, doctors are saying, okay, we've tried all the pharmaceuticals, then try cannabis. So that's typically stage 1. Then what happens is we expand the number of conditions. So there are 4 in Ireland, there are 60 in Germany. And over time, these conditions evolve and grow. We move from cannabis being a medicine of last resort to cannabis being a medicine of first choice. So it's no longer you have to go through having the pharmaceuticals thing and then not working. You can just move straight to cannabis. It moves from being a medicine that a consultant can prescribe to a medicine that a GP can prescribe. Once you see this domestic demand for cannabis, then countries say, well, actually, we should implement our own industry. We should actually have cannabis grown domestically.
Are there any European countries going down that road?
So right now, there are licensed application processes in places like Germany, Holland, Italy, Croatia, Greece, Malta, Cyprus, Poland. You can go on and on.
Is that to grow cannabis for the domestic market or to export?
It's both. One of the interesting things in the cannabis market is going to be to see how the global flows emerge. Right now, though, you're seeing really only 2 countries that are producing for export, Canada and the Netherlands. Over the next 2, 3, 4 years, you'll start to see places basically banded around the equator, because that's where cannabis grows very, very cheaply. It needs 12 hours of sunlight and 12 hours of nighttime to grow naturally in fields, and you'll see the cost of cannabis plummet, and you'll see cannabis being traded, and it will flow across the globe, primarily in the form of cannabis oil. But this is going to be a global industry very quickly.
So in terms of where should people in the UK be looking for examples of good practice in regard to this? To Canada, to Colorado, to Germany?
I would say that Canada is an interesting model. It's probably the most advanced model, given the nature of the move. Canada's going to open up a recreational market in October this year. So they've had a medical market. North America is just 2 minutes of North America. Cannabis emerged as a sort of medicine in California at the beginning of the 80s on the back of the AIDS epidemic. And so young guys who were struggling with this chemotherapy were finding comfort from cannabis in terms of an antiemetic. It would stop them vomiting, it would promote their appetite, it would get them to eat. And it just sort of moved from California in the early 80s. The first legally licensed medical market was in 96 in California and in Israel. And since then, we've just seen states adopt this as a medicine without a federal framework in the US, but lots of states individually adopting cannabis. And from there, it's just, spilt into Europe, and we talk about an S-curve of adoption. It just so happens that California, Colorado, Canada are at the front, Germany's in the middle, we're a laggard, but really there are a bunch of experiments. The way to think about it is that there are a bunch of experiments around the world, and we're in this process of collecting data to understand what do these different regulatory models look like.
Is there not a reasonable, given some of the concerns that people have expressed here already about some issues impacting mental health, is there not a concern that the way the California model has evolved, or Canada, has it seeped into the recreational market?
Yeah, so I don't believe anyone above the age of 25, below the age of 25 should have access to cannabis, given the nature of the developing brain. There are some cases in childhood epilepsy with non-THC products where they've shown to have effect. On the rest of it, I think we need to do a lot more research. Right, there is going to be a role for some low THC products. For some folks who are under the age of 25 for specific conditions, but unfortunately we don't know what they are right now.
Okay, that's very useful. So in terms of Nadelman's maxim about this is the year where business takes over from activism, sorry, Clark.
It's all right.
Do you think that's a reasonable kind of prediction?
Yeah, there's money flowing into the sector now. So about $10 billion has been raised on the Toronto Stock Exchange for companies now worth circa $40 billion, and that brings with it lobbying efforts and it allows you to open doors at very senior levels in governments to talk about the nature of the industry that's being developed. And so, yeah, for sure, we're now seeing large companies spin up interesting research facilities, bringing academics on board. The stigma is being blown away by, frankly, patients talking to each other about the effect that cannabis has on them in their lives. And yeah, I think we're starting to see business try to shape this, and it's moving away from that sort of traditional activist model of guys outside Parliament shouting at MPs to guys like me engaging with MPs. And it's a very different model.
Okay, thanks for that, Gavin. Questions for Gavin, please? Great stuff. Can I start with you, please? Sorry, say who you are.
That's not me.
Hi, we live in the United States and primarily Midwest, but I'm just going to, I know this is controversial, but just a couple of thoughts. Knowing that in California, they are, you go out there and it's lime is the color to recognize where the marijuana is, and marijuana cures everything. And that's okay. I don't want to be derogatory if anybody's here from California. I'm just voicing thoughts overall. Colorado, of course, everybody looks at Colorado, and certainly because I also treat children, we've had a few concerns about the respiratory depressions and deaths from children. And I know in our state of Indiana, everybody's concerned because they said, how do we keep children from getting it, and how do we make sure that it's the right percentage and all that? And I said, well, we have alcohol, and we still have people who drink over the limit and drive nonetheless. So since I've been here in the UK, people are explaining to me that drinking and driving is much less here. So this is a learning process for us. Of course, in the Midwest, we're looking at the West Coast, we're looking at Colorado, we're looking at California, and I think that's caused us to be a bit more conservative. In our area, they've recently approved CBD for epilepsy, refractory to treat epilepsy, and Michigan, Illinois, you can get medical cards for pain, especially like traumatic brain injuries and things like that. So, I guess also having many people with multiple sclerosis, again, just my opinion. Interestingly, in our part of the U.S., they're looking more at chronic pain and they're looking at epilepsy. My folks with MS are suffering, quite honestly, the most, in my humble opinion. So I think it's very interesting that, to my knowledge, we're not yet looking at multiple sclerosis. But I think what I just wanted to say, looking at North America, I do think California and Colorado perhaps have skewed, some of the perspectives about medical marijuana. And I think it's interesting because most of my 20-somethings are all moving to Colorado and getting jobs to hang out and work out there.
It's got the highest rate of inward migration in the US. I mean, we haven't talked about the economic impact, but all the millennials are moving to Colorado.
Well, I guess enough said. But I hope I didn't offend anybody. I guess what I just wanted to say is I do think part of you said you were having certainly the battles, and thank you for the battles that you're taking on. But I think I understand that when you look at certain states and what happened with marijuana, it's just going to take a while for people to kind of get a different perspective.
That's very helpful. Thanks so much for that. Let's get this perspective from the other side of the Atlantic. Sorry, can I ask you again? Sorry, we've got just this lady here, please. Thank you.
Yes, I'm very much aware of Colorado and what's happened in the Senate House in Canada, the sort of problems that have come up. You know, you've described the THC, the fact that the GP would prescribe a higher or a lower amount according to your level of pain or whatever. I can't in a million years in this country seeing any GP sitting there saying, well, I think you need 80% THC, or I think we'll go for 8% for you. And in Canada, it's very specific, the amount of THC. In Canada, you don't have medical professionals saying, you know, oh, you need more THC than he does. I think there would be absolutely not ill-advised, but it would be against their, you know, medical procedures. So I'm kind of...
What basis, sorry?
You know, with regards to medical, I think we'll have to be very careful. I mean, Canada, I'm really aware of, I've studied the Senate House, all the concerns, you know, that sort of they're dealing with. I know that's mainly recreational, but I cannot see any, you know, I'd be very surprised if any doctor in California or Colorado is sitting there saying, well, we'll prescribe 80% THC.
I have two doctors' recommendations from California from GPs
who would
that also
prescribe
told me that.
80% THC.
But no, you're absolutely right, because
You'll
the way the model
never
works...
get that in this country.
No, the way the model works in the
Millions.
US is you go and see a doctor, you get a recommendation, and the recommendation is just for a cannabis product. It gives you the right to go into a dispensary, and then you have a conversation with a bud tender who typically isn't a medically trained professional around this, you know, which products should you consume. So look, I agree on that side. It's not medical practitioners that are dispensing the products, and that's
So
be the
who
difference.
in law would be responsible for this person getting 80% THC? Who in law would be responsible for that?
In the European model,
In
a
California?
European model, I see products being taken to healthcare regulators, and effectively I take a product pack to the MHRA, and I'd say we're going to put this through either a clinical trial, or if it's too long-winded to do a clinical trial, we'd gather some initial data to give the establishment, the medical establishment, some comfort that there is some basis for this medicine working, and then we'd offer it on prescription to patients, typically who've tried all the other pharmaceuticals. If Clark is sitting here saying, I've tried the whole array of pharmaceuticals for MS and I found this unlicensed medicine that works, I absolutely think he should have the right to get it on prescription via a doctor through the NHS.
So you think an
from a pharmacy.
NHS doctor should be legally allowed to prescribe 80% THC?
Why shouldn't a doctor be legally allowed to do
Well, I would be very surprised if any doctor in this country would actually go along with that. They might.
Many will.
Very some-
Many will.
I mean,
Okay, can we just open this conversation up? Can we just move to the gentleman in the front row? It's getting into the lively conversation I wanted to have, so that's good. So can you say hello?
Yeah, good day. I'm Martin Judson. I'm an addictionist from London, Ontario, Canada. And my concern is that any physician who is prescribing, whether they're adequately trained in addiction medicine and are aware of the potential risks of prescribing THC, which can trigger the desire to use other substances. And doctors in Canada, they can prescribe as much THC as they want. And some of those doctors are lamentably ignorant about the dangers of prescribing, and some of them prescribe fairly high concentrations of THC to people who are under the age of 25. And as long as the doctors are being regulated and are well trained in addiction medicine, then it's not going to be a problem. But I think and I don't think that medical marijuana should be a case of last resort. We know that it does help in certain cases, but why do patients have to go through all this polypharmacy before being allowed to try something which may work? But I'm a proponent of predominantly CBD and not THC. I think that is the risky one.
Okay, can I take, so this gentleman here, please? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Lee. I'm Lee.
Yep.
I'm an addiction therapist at a treatment centre. My big fear is around the recreational use, and I think the fact that there's people moving to Denver already highlights the fact that they're moving there for the recreational use and they're not going to get caught. And having been through recovery myself, I know if I was able to get cannabis legally, I would then be going, just like people, I'm pleased that it's going to maybe help, I'm pleased it's really helping you, by the way, and I'm pleased that it's going to maybe help reduce some of the addictions to some of the opioid pharmaceuticals. But my concern would be that the addict will then be going back to the doctor, oh, it's not really working now, I need a stronger dose, and a stronger dose. And the fact that it's legalised and on prescription, I deal with so many patients that don't believe they're addicts because they're getting prescribed medication, yet they abuse it.
Yeah.
And we know, and I'm sure some people won't be abusing it, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of people that would. And that's my big fear.
I think that just answered your own question, though. Sorry, I'm not even about it.
Pass the mic over. Just
It's the same with every medication. I'm prescribed tramadol, naproxen, dihydrocodone. Ironically, I'm off my face on drugs, and I could become addicted to tramadol. Instead, I use cannabis. And it's the same with any substance. I used to manage a bariatric centre. People were addicted to food for whatever reason. Any substance is bad for any person in different ways. And just because it doesn't help one person doesn't mean that I shouldn't have access to it helping me.
I'm not saying that shouldn't have access, but
you can't have.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's the regulatory framework that we put in place, and there's public education.
It feels to me that
it has to. Well, we need to have a sensible conversation about this and not funnel it away so that Clark has to grow his own.
I think the issue, if I may, I think the issue in the UK is from travelling the world and looking at the various markets, there's a very particular context in the UK because of the nature of policing of cannabis, right? I mean, it's a very particular kind of. I mean, when I polled people last year, over 90% of people who use cannabis had no real fear of the criminal justice system, right? So we don't have the notion of for most people who use cannabis in this country at the moment, they do so without having any fear that their doors are going to be kicked down and arrested for doing so. Yeah, there's a sort of perception in the focus groups that I've shared that both cannabis can. One of the things, there's a lot of kind of things that are kind of plainly intention when you do focus groups on cannabis in Britain. So what unanimously get people saying it's really good for my granddad's arthritis. At the long time they say, oh, my son's had it and he's got dropped out of his A-levels and skipped his school. And you get therapy, people saying it's too easy available, people saying I'm glad it's people not being arrested. There's all these contradictions going on in people's views about cannabis in Britain at the moment. And I think that reflects, and we'll come on to Crispin in a second because he's the person who's most likely to bring about change here in the UK. It strikes me that what we have is a real black hole in policy in Britain around this, a lot of willful blindness, a lot of people turning the blind eyes to very obvious things, and it seems to me that these sort of debates are really, really helpful because they bring this thing out into the surface. And I think at the moment, it strikes me that there's too much easy availability. Cannabis is too easily available across the board in the UK, when actually you can see the benefits of regulation in other North American states. I mean, either we're going to decide to take this thing out, which I don't think is very likely, or we're going to have to put it into a regulatory framework. You know, so I think. But I want to just take one final question. Yeah.
So again, and I don't use marijuana, and I'm just here perhaps to stir the pot, but I in the United States, we have, again, this big heroin problem. I know we've been talking about this since we got here yesterday, big heroin opioid problem. So now that we've got all these really good policies in place, which I have assisted with, it's very harder to get some of these drugs. But folks who want to use something find a way. They're now using Neurontin, gabapentin, abusing it. So some of the Midwest now states are going to make that a controlled substance. So I guess just what I want us to all think about is lots of medications have terrible side effects. I thought of some of the MS medications that one of the side effects is death.
Yeah.
And if you don't die from it, then some of the other side effects are so bad you wish to God you had died. But, and again, I'm just offering a few views here. But I guess what I'm hearing is, yes, can marijuana be abused? Absolutely. I'm a psychiatrist. It has side effects of psychosis and other things. So do other medications. I treat children who take stimulants for ADD, FDA approved, and then they tell me, Dr. Mueller, I'm seeing dogs. You don't have a dog. You know, that's the problem. So just thoughts. I think that that we all understand this is controversial, but there's certainly going to be benefits, and some patients are going to see really good benefits.
I really appreciate your contributions. I'm just going to, at this point, bring in Crispin. Thank you, Gavin. And we'll get a chance to hear from Gavin and Clark again at the end. I want to introduce Crispin. As I said, Crispin is the politician on the panel, and probably the most prominent politician here in the United Kingdom who's focused in on drug policy and drug reform. So, Crispin, do you want to say a little bit about yourself? How you get involved in this?
Steve, so my name's Crispin Blunt. I'm the Member of Parliament for Reigate, and my principal policy engagement with this as Minister for Prisons, Probation and Youth Justice between 2010 and 2012, when I could then see for myself, not least on my 70 prison visits in the course of my time in office, the actual, and talking to probation and the police and dealing with integrated offender management, just the cost of our criminal policy of banning all narcotic drugs, what the cost was to the country and the criminal justice system. And nothing was more pathetic than seeing the queue of emaciated men queuing up for their methadone in prison, and then knowing that they were going to get discharged from prison, probably not, almost certainly not having had long enough inside to have addressed their addiction, or for great organisations like Forward to have had the resources and the time to get them to a place where they were off their addiction, going straight back outside. And then if they weren't getting the support they need in the community, addiction was driving half of acquisitive crime in the United Kingdom. It still is. So if you're burgled or your shop is shoplifted, the likelihood is it's someone who is then trying to find the next hit. And then to try and have a internal political discussion about what we should do about that. Should we be addressing the issue of prohibition? That discussion was closed down by my political colleagues simply because we didn't want to go there and be seen to be sending any kind of signal that we were going soft in the war on drugs. Now, I think it was kind of insane that one couldn't actually even have internally a proper conversation about the cost of drugs policy. And then, my views established were clear that in my own mind, I would have taken what I assumed would be the public health hit in terms of if you went to a legalized market of an increase in consumption in the public, if they had the opportunity to use narcotic drugs, for the massive savings you would make to the criminal justice system as a consequence. And in terms of the national cost-benefit analysis, to my way of thinking, this seemed pretty much a rather simple calculation to make. However, since then, getting engaged in this area more closely, and looking at the example of Portugal, who had decriminalized effectively personal usage levels of drugs, the Portuguese experience was not a significant increase in usage once it became, once you were not being gone after by the Portuguese police for drugs that were in your own possession. Indeed, they have a public health policy and a harm reduction policy, whereas if you're lifted 2 or 3 times, then you will be mandated into health treatment for your perceived addiction. Now, that comes with none of the benefits of taking the supply of illegal drugs out of the hands of organized crime. And this is where you have in my sense, this is where it is a no-brainer. We have gifted a $500 billion a year industry into the hands of organized crime. Why are we surprised that 25,000 Mexicans get killed every year, not of drugs, but of drugs policy, where the cartels, where the industry is at its strongest in the supply chain in the United States, fight the hardest over the ownership of their business. And they can't fight in the courts because it is an illegal business. So they kill the police, they kill people who get in their way, they kill members of other cartels in order to advance and defend their own business ownership. We actually also see that in a measure in the streets of London. Why do you think these kids are knifing each other up on the streets of London? It is not exclusively an explanation as to why the drugs industry, but by and large, these young gangs, the economic driver for them, the bling, the girls, the cars, comes from the economics of the drugs industry. just imagine what would happen if you took the supply chain of that industry out of the hands of organised crime and made it illegal. Now that's dealing with the whole issue of prohibition, and it is a debate I want to get into and advance. And when I stopped being chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee after the general election in 2017, the opportunity, almost by coincidence at the same time that happened, the government published its drug strategy, and there was a debate on the drug strategy in Parliament just before we rose to the summer recess. I took part in that debate, gave a flavour of the views I've just given to you, and was then agreeably surprised by the significant amount of interest there was that finally here was a conservative. I regard myself as a mainstream conservative, whether my conservative colleagues do or not is quite another matter, who was prepared to engage in this debate on the side of liberalisation. And so the leadership of a group in Parliament on drug policy reform came up, and both myself and a Labour MP called Jeff Smith, who is out of the music industry and had seen, in that sense, his view on the consequence of drug consumption on young people as a DJ, which is what his background was, that both of us have joined Baroness Molly Meacher as co-chairs of the drug policy reform all-party group, with a view to dragging this debate into the mainstream of the political and parliamentary conversation. And that then takes us into the debate as it now stands globally and of course in the United Kingdom. The issue around prohibition of all narcotic drugs and the impact that has globally it sits underneath the reason why we were run out of Helmand province by the Taliban, in one sense, alongside what's happening in Mexico and Colombia and the rest, and what's happening in knife crime on our streets. That is a long burn issue where the debate around prohibition has got to go on, has got to be examined. However, the immediate concern here is that the United Kingdom is very conservative on these policies. A policy is owned by both medicinal cannabis and cannabis as a recreational drug is owned by the Home Office. And of course we're now watching whilst half the states of the United States and half the states of the European Union have found a way to give their people the opportunity to get the benefit of the medical benefits that can come from drugs derived from cannabis. And here in the United Kingdom, it is still a Schedule 1 drug. It is very difficult to get a license, though not impossible, to do the research. And indeed, we have given a license to a company called GW Pharma some time ago in the late 1990s. And it is, of course, a rather rich irony that the ownership of most of the research on medicinal cannabis is by GW Pharma, with hundreds of scientists having punted hundreds of millions of pounds into this area over the last 20 years or so, and it is a British company exporting a particular medicinal product, Sativex, and they're about to get a license for Epilidex out of the United Kingdom. And this is where you then get the whole set of interests around big pharma facing up to the interests around cannabis-derived medicine. So that's my background that's getting into this. And then in the course of the last year, I have, having gone from a position of an assumption around the criminal justice benefits of prohibition, I've then frankly been on a pretty steep learning curve about all aspects of the rest of drugs policy, aided enormously by Steve Moore and his colleagues at Volteface, and also organisations like Transform, who have done some of the more work around prohibition. But the debate in the United Kingdom now is around how do we get medicinal cannabis across the line. And my colleagues on the all-party group are certainly convinced that we've got to find a way to help my ministerial colleagues and the officials in government who are going to have to deliver them a licensing and regulation system for medicinal cannabis, which is not going to be seen as simply a gateway to a recreational market. That's where the politics in the United Kingdom is now, and that's where our focus as a group is now. Indeed, we will be discussing later on today how we can further disaggregate the debate around recreational use and around prohibition from the discussion about getting British people the benefits that are sat there to be had from the medicinal use of cannabis. That's probably enough for an introduction.
That's wonderful. That's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
I'll just move straight to questions because I'm conscious of the time we've got. So, thank you for coming along today and finding time, Crispin, to be here. I want to take some questions. Thank you. Just mind say
Crispin,
who you are.
Roger Mayer, I'm in the treatment industry. Your last comment, why are you trying to fight so hard to distinguish between the medicinal cannabis and recreational cannabis? Because surely medicinal cannabis is just the front runner for the recreational industry anyway.
Well, if those arguments are presented in those terms, my parliamentary colleagues are going to say no, and ministerial colleagues are going to say no. So we will then simply have to wait a very considerable length of time longer for British people to get the benefit of medicines derived from cannabis. So that's why it's a political question. That's the answer. It's not it's therefore. So my one of my colleagues, Sir Mike Penning, was former drugs minister, extremely conservative. With a small c on these issues, was one of the minister who had to drive the early stages of the Psychoactive Substances Act through Parliament. And on this issue of medicinal cannabis, when I asked an urgent question to the government about the treatment of Alfie Dingley, he was sitting behind me on the benches and he leaned over to me and said, "Crispin, I don't agree with you about very much, but on this I do agree with you." And the campaign then invited him to help get the treatment for Alfie Dingley, who's one of the reasons why his parents were then received into Downing Street, had the opportunity to meet the Prime Minister, and I've got to be able to convince people like him that getting British patients access to medicines derived from cannabis is not a route to a recreational market. That is a different debate for a different time in the UK.
Okay. Thank you. Helpful question. Back corner up here, please. Right in the far corner, thanks.
Good afternoon, my name is Samaya. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I actually have a few questions. So, one of the things was you mentioned about it being $500 billion in other parts of the world.
It's the estimated global value of the illegal drugs industry.
Okay, so if it were made legal, if it is going to be part of a business model, then would actually some of that money also get actually contributed again into kind of additional treatment options? So in addition to being prescribed cannabis, could patients also be offered talking therapies alongside, not forced, but actually offered it?
Well, that's all. That's the whole illegal drugs market, all narcotic drugs. So it would include things like heroin and cocaine and the rest. However, on cannabis, one of the statistics we were presented with in the United States on a visit Steve and I did a couple of weeks ago was that in 2006, the second most valuable crop in the United States was corn at $23 billion a year to the American economy. We were told that the most valuable crop at $35 billion a year was cannabis. Now, and what we saw in Washington State was the move of to create the legal market. It is much cheaper to produce something legally than it is illegally. You get quality of supply and control. You can obviously do it in the open. You obviously got inspectors coming to check your premises and what you're doing and making sure you're not diverting product out of the delivery chain, out of the retail chain where it's going to get taxed. But you can experiment with how your proper plant scientists in there working openly and how to make the product more efficient. They're going to kill economically the illegal suppliers, simply in terms of the production advantages a legal industry has over an illegal industry. And that, of course, means that you will then know, and if you then have the additional confidence that you know the product you're buying hasn't been sprayed with some interesting pesticide in the attic of someone's house in order to advance its production, that's going to give you confidence as well to go and buy in the legal retail stores that are there. And then you get the tax question. And in Washington State, they are going to take This year, about $370 million in fiscal tax revenue on the cannabis industry. And that's going to produce about 10% of their Medicaid budget. Obviously, it's then an issue about where it gets spent. I would certainly say if we were going to move to a legal market, it would be essential that we properly fund addiction services right over the country. We have an alcohol epidemic in our country in terms of addiction, and the addiction services available to people in the UK are woeful in order to address it. And given the amount of the fiscal income to the government from alcohol, I think if we were starting again from scratch, we would probably put more aside to deal with the public health implications of legalization. But if you get to a legal and regulated market and set the regulations, including taxation, at the appropriate level, then I think you're in an infinitely better place than you are if you're either have a totally liberal market where you can buy the stuff off the shelf at Tesco, which no one would be suggesting, or you in effect have a totally liberal market in the criminal, where the supply chain is entirely in the hands of criminals. You've no idea what you're buying, and the likelihood is that some of that stuff is going to kill the people who consume it, as some of our children die of ecstasy poisoning because they don't know, because what they bought turned out not to be MDMA.
Can I just take a couple more questions? We've got 20 minutes to go before lunch, and then I can. I'm just going to take the gist. I will come back to you, but if I may. But I can just take this chap from Centrepoint.
Oh, yeah, just two slight deviates. Just a question. I was always confused with the Sathianathan spray because I know it's part of the trials and it has been available. I understand for British doctors to some extent to prescribe. My understanding was that maybe
it's a postcode lottery. Because NICE haven't approved it. It depends on the doctor whether they want to give it to you or not. Where I live in Brighton and where I used to live in Reading, I'm not allowed Sativex. So although I have gone through all of the process of trying every single other drug before it, although I say cannabis works, Sativex has THC and CBD in it, and all the other cannabinoids, it is cannabis. Can I have it? And they say no, it's too expensive.
But you could have it if you paid for it.
Yeah.
So is that to cover the patent?
I could have it privately, yeah.
So just to cover the patent, right, basically?
Yeah, it's actually licensed for spasticity, not for pain.
Okay.
Yeah.
And my other concern was, with all the good work that you guys are doing, that if we do get cannabis-based products on the market in a medicinal value, that I would really want to know that it came from a natural source, and I do not want the kind of big pharmaceutical companies trying to make synthetic kind of cannabis-based products and palming them off as having an equal value compared to the kind of raw products that yourself might be using.
Well, that's where you have the complexity of the MHRA's role in all of this. And in trying to look around at all the different models that might apply in the United Kingdom, I think, and my research is not completed here, but I'd be interested in Gavin's thought about whether the New York model is the one that is, New York State model is the one most likely that would run here, where you have doctors who are, this picks up the point about whether doctors know what they're doing when they're prescribing this. It would only be doctors who had undergone a cannabis medicine instruction course who then understood what they were, hopefully what they were doing, who would then be qualified to write a prescription for a cannabis-based medicine, and then it would be then an individual prescription solution is probably what will run in the UK. And I don't think that's going to include combusting your medicine.
No, there's a big hole around doctor education. Harvard Medical School released their continuing medical education program for cannabis as a medicine last year. We don't have an equivalent really in Europe. What you typically see is in any European country there's a handful of doctors who have a personal passion for understanding cannabis, and doctors are a unique set of people. They only really listen to other doctors, and honestly they only really listen to other doctors in their own country. And so you typically see the 5 doctors in Italy who've gone and learnt about this. They're talking to the other doctors and telling them how to prescribe. So it's a very sort of grassroots type conversation at the moment in Europe, but we need to formalise it and have some sort of curriculum whereby doctors across the EU can sign up and we understand what this looks like.
Would they be down to the pharmaceutical companies as to what they prescribe in a sense? Or they might
well, it would then be down to the MHRA to approve what goes into the market, and then whether it's synthetic or natural or whatever actually then it should then be a proper scientific question that the medicine has actually got the scientific credentials to do what it says it does.
And you're in this very this new world for me of how are drugs marketed to doctors. So what does a pharmaceutical sales force look like? What are the marketing materials that a rep typically goes and talks to a doctor about? And what does the equivalent look like for cannabis medicines? So do companies like mine have to go and hire pharmaceutical sales force folks to go and have these conversations? And yes, we will. Who's going to educate those people? TBD. Right? We all need to
But
figure that
this is where you've got the complexity of a cannabis-based medicine compared to other medicines, where the standard approval procedure will be kind of 10 years of trials of a particular molecule and its particular effect on a particular disease.
Yeah.
If you've got a cannabis-based medicine, the balance of THC and CBD that's going to apply for if you're dealing with depression or chronic pain is likely to be different for different people, and they're going to have to go away and aim off and adjust about different balances between THC and CBD until they get the balance right for them. Now that's quite a difficult concept for doctors to have to grapple with. Is that there's an element of trying to understand what the right usage pattern is that's going to work for you.
There's a very good book if you want to read more about this. There's a terrific book called Stoned by David Kasserit. He's a popular science writer in the US, and he's written a really good, really accessible book on the subject. And what David argues that the conversation we're having here is a subset of a bigger question in medicine about the rise of crowdsourced medicine. And it's something he watched as a practicing doctor in Philadelphia, where he watched, so towards the end, he said at the start of the 2000s, people started turning up with things they printed off Google. And this is now, and the conversation started becoming this, and the whole relationship between the patient and doctor has been transformed.
Yeah.
And he sees like medical cannabis as being a subset of a much larger issue about people researching their own medical needs. I'm sure many of you will recognise that, So, but yeah, if you do want to understand more about the issue, David's got a very dispassionate account of the evolution of medical cannabis. It's well worth having a read at. This chap at the back.
Sorry, I'm Vikram. I'm a psychiatrist. I work in the NHS. So, in your discussions currently,
is this for Crispin?
Yeah. Sorry, with regards to the medical use of cannabis, is there an aspect of the prisons where synthetic cannabis use has led to a lot of, deaths, and what aspect of that would be, discussed in
I wouldn't
your
feel
discussions?
qualified to be able to tell you what frankly, and yet the difference between synthetic and the stuff derived from a grown a product that's grown in a greenhouse somewhere or in a factory, or indeed outside. Those are questions that again have to be for the regulator to have to decide. The regulator's going to have to probably change their current approach if this happens. And what we're wrestling with is exactly how to change the law. So what statutory instrument needs to be passed under the Drugs Misuse Act or any other piece of legislation in order to get the right market that means that we can have a medical market in which people have confidence at this stage that this is not simply a route to a recreational market in the UK, and then gets the right products, then gets the opportunity to get the right products on the market. Frankly, whether they're synthetic or whether they're natural based, I wouldn't begin to claim expertise in that area.
Synthetic, what I meant was, recreational use, which is spice, which is synthetic cannabis. And it's got very high potency, very high affinity for the receptors. So that's where you get the medical emergencies.
Well, I think if I was prescribed spice, I'd be thinking pretty hard about it, given what effect it has on the street.
Spice to me is also it's an outcome of a prohibited market.
Yeah.
Can I just take this gentleman over here? Yeah. Do you want to say who you are, please?
I'm Jess Smith from the States, study at Texas Tech, which has one of the leading addiction programs, and then also a person in recovery. I guess my question is, have y'all looked at the effects that the legalization of both recreational and then medical has had in the States on neighboring states and how that might affect the UK?
Can you provide some insights into what?
All right, so it's legal in Colorado and California, and what we're seeing is rather than a lot of it coming from Mexico, where the quality's pretty awful, you have a lot coming from Colorado and California, all the way up to New York, Texas. So maybe in the states where it's legal, the crime is down, but they're transporting it more easily all over. And that's something we've seen. So I don't know if y'all have looked at that and taken into account how it might affect other neighboring countries or something like that.
Is that an argument for legalizing across the United States? Or
just neighboring areas, how that might affect y'all or impact.
The issue we ran across was the state's anxiety, Washington State, to make sure there wasn't diversion. So it's illegal to supply it, to export it out of Washington State. And of course, if it was, then the state would be losing its fiscal revenue. So there was a protection of taxation anxiety, which obviously meant their accountability system of every plant having to be accounted for in the legal production centre, to make sure there wasn't diversion out of the legal sector into for example, as you describe, into the next door state.
It wouldn't be. I was waiting for the Brexit question to come in, so right. Yes, sorry. Yes.
Thank you. I actually left the Labour Party years ago when Tony Blair's group ignored all doctors, teachers, social workers, everybody. And
Did you join the Conservatives?
Deregulated alcohol, gambling, and now we have the suicide. And remember, I work with young people. Terrible, terrible problems. They didn't listen to the doctors. They didn't care, or teachers or parents even, And the alcohol industry in this country is so powerful that recently at the General Medical meeting at the General Medical Council, it was declared that the alcohol industry is so powerful that no labels can be put on any can alcohol drinks or cans describing what's actually in them, although for foodstuffs we have to. Anyway, sorry, I'll be very brief. I think it's absolutely crucial. I'm very sceptical now of politicians. It's really, really important because what was not done with gambling, it was not done with alcohol, and there are many young people who've lost their lives and their suicides that didn't need to happen. You need to go over. Colorado provides like a 140-page document every year. Go in, talk to the police, talk to the people, talk to the schools, go into the hospitals. Absolutely. The posting, cannabis is posted out to lots of other states. There are other states who are absolutely, now because of Colorado, they're not going to touch it. Remember, it's against federal law in America. Federal law is superior to state law. Federal law says, it still sticks with, it's illegal. It's a strange system. But, I would be very worried given what's happened with alcohol. Other countries don't say, oh yeah, Britain's got it right with alcohol. Let's see what they did with the deregulation. We'll do the same. Talk to Americans and they'll say, of course, over in Britain you've got all those problems with alcohol. So I'd be very worried if people in your group are not going over to Colorado, spending time there. Go to someone like Hazelden and talk to the experts there. Really get your head around what it is and what it means. I mean, even in Canada, they haven't thought it through. The landlords in Canada are absolutely up in arms because people are going to be allowed to grow cannabis in their apartments. And of course, landlords are like absolutely horrified. So and the police are not sure about what's legal and what's, if you get 80% THC, which you wouldn't be in Canada, and you go out driving, the police haven't got a clue yet in Canada about cannabis. There's so many issues. Anyway, I think politicians need to really do their work.
Will you go to Colorado?
I agree with everything you've said. It's just I'd rather we have the conversation because right now it's not happening. And I spend a lot of time talking to folks in Colorado and California and.
But the politicians, they can't even legalize for labels on alcohol cans and bottles.
Well, hang on a minute. Alcohol is a licensed and regulated industry here, and I agree with the kind of horror show of the early of Bernie Ecclestone being able to get tobacco advertising sustained in the early.
The research wasn't done by the politicians. They didn't listen to people like doctors and teachers and social workers who.
No, I agree with that. I'm trying to agree with you.
I'd be very worried that your group, whoever you are, have not seriously carried out the research. And go over to Canada, talk to the politicians, because they're grappling
desperately
all
to agree
sorts
with
of
you and
problems.
say that, and that's which is why I spent a week of my Easter vacation in Washington State, looking at what the issues are in Washington State with Steve, who helped arrange the visit, precisely to learn and to understand all of these issues, and to look at the experience of Canada, who are coming to the recreational market, which is not we're not in the recreational market discussion in the United Kingdom yet. So we're going to have plenty of time. Don't worry.
Kind of sort out the alcohol, bring in some better regulations regards alcohol, get labels and onto the bottles.
Well, which is why there is now
sort that one out, because
which is why there is now a discussion about minimum prices.
The world realises that this country has really messed up with alcohol and gambling and gaming. They know that. Get that right before we're introducing something else.
So I should just suffer until that's right then, should I?
I think there leaves room for a lot of reflection, a lot of learning lessons from tobacco and the alcohol industry, and now we can kind of like look at
and which is why there is a happy medium here. Yeah. There is a happy medium between, if you have a utterly liberalised market, which you could say existed in the United States in the late 19th century, and which then created the climate under which prohibition could get passed. You then saw prohibition of alcohol happen, and the catastrophe that then followed with the rise of organised crime and people poisoning themselves with industrial spirit because they didn't know what they were doing. So the answer is not either a completely liberal market or prohibition. Prohibition produces these hideous consequences. You've got to get the licensing and the regulation right, therefore the taxation right, so you don't then overtax it and then create a black market as a consequence of the taxation. And then you've got to get the regulations right about the circumstances under which people are able to access whatever the drug is. Now, 90% of people in the United Kingdom can happily use alcohol and know how to regulate their own behaviour. There is 10% of people, and these obviously do not know, lose that battle, and then it end up with all the consequences that many people at this conference are then assisting with them to try to get better. We should be able to significantly improve on those numbers with a much stronger public health message and better licensing and better regulation.
Okay, everyone, I know that lunch is going to be served in a few minutes' time, so I'm just going to at this point say thank you to everyone for contributing to such a lively conversation. Thanks to Crispin, to Gavin, and to Clark, who's disappeared for now, for their contributions. Thank you for your time. Thanks very much.